Great.
Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Bom dia. Buenos dias. It's morning here in Brazil, and we are another day with the Kropotkin International Colóquio. And today we are going to have let's see. We are going to have five presentations by their own academics, and another one will be read by Ferretti. The presentations today will be from Emily HALLEZ, What Geography Ought to Be, Pyotr Kropotkin, Halford Mackinder, and the Shaping of British Geographical Education. The other one is Antônio Ferraz de Oliveira, Reinventing Revolution, Krapotkin, the French Revolution and Historical Writing. Okay. The other one will be read by Federico Ferretti from Sergey Saytanov, the All-Russian Public Committee for the Perpetuation of the Memory of P.A. Kropotkin, APCE. Okay, it will be read. José Antonio Gutierrez will present Violence and the Sociology of the Modern State, from Kropotkin to Tilly Xavier. From Kropotkin to Tilly. Yeah, the punctuation is a problem here. The next one is Xavier HALLEZ, and we'll present the talk, I Am a Man. He will talk about the influence of Kropotkin ideas in Muslims. So we'll start, we'll have 15 minutes for each participant, and when it comes to 5 minutes to ending, I will tell everyone that it's coming close. And that's it. Then we will have some questions from the public. And from each other, we can ask questions to each other. And all right, let's start then with Emily HALLEZ. Emily, please. We can ask questions to each other. And all right. Emily, please. We can ask questions to each other. And all right.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, everybody. I'm delighted to be here with you today. I'm getting a bit of feedback, so I hope you can hear me clearly. Okay, great. Thanks very much, everybody. Begin in the Royal Geographical Society map room. In the 1903 discussion, after Élise Repou's on spherical maps and relief lecture, the geographer Halford Mackinder warned that, quote,
Emily, sorry?
Investigation. In school time...
Emily?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I guess you are with YouTube open on some...
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, I guess that's where the sound from.
I'm so sorry. Yes, let me shut it.
On some... Yeah, I guess that's...
Okay, technical problem solved. We are back with Emily.
So sorry, people. We'll share
Emily,
my
are you
screen
there?
again. If the computer... Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'll just be a moment to share my screen again. Okay. Oh, okay. So, can you hear me? Yes? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can.
Yep.
Okay, great. So, as I was saying, we are in the Royal Geographical Society map room, and in 1903, after the Élysée Recluse on spherical maps and reliefs lecture, the geographer Halford Mackinder warned that, quote, "The model is rather a weapon of teaching than a means of investigation. In schools, time is limited, and you must be content with producing an impression of relative truth and producing it quickly, and afterwards the fact of exaggeration can be separately impressed." Krapotkin responded cautiously. He said, "Maps constructed both on the real scale and the exaggerated scale ought to be found in every well-appointed school." Reclus disagreed, though he said it would, quote, "be better to have the two things, to have the exaggeration, which could be shown on the map, and the true line to show the true state of things." He explained that we have had a bad education. You are led to think that nature has more relief in reality than she has. So this offers a point of entry into some of the historiography in Kropotkin and Mackinder. The commonly held view that anarchist geographers were marginalized has recently been unsettled. Although, as Ferretti states, their political philosophy challenged the status quo and ran counter to the political mainstream, they were active in the rational and informed public debate about geography education and were outsiders speaking from the center. Consequently, we might reassess our perceptions of that geographical center and those at its heart and their motivations. Halford Mackinder, who you see here on the right, is not a name that many of you Kropotkin scholars will know, I imagine. Indeed, for many geographers, Mackinder embodies the epitome of British imperialism. And what follows, therefore, seeks to show both at once the educational philosophies and practices of these two men. So they shared a common reference point in John Tyndall, the Professor of Natural Philosophy at the Royal Institution, London. In What Geography Ought to Be, Kropotkin astutely adapted his argument to a British audience. He referred to Tyndall twice. Mr. Tyndall tried once to impress on his hearers, namely that no deeply going scientific reasoning is possible without the help of greatly developed imaginative power, and they will utilize the child's imagination not for stuffing it with superstition, but for awakening the love of scientific studies. And my own recent scholarship has demonstrated Mackinder's exposure as a teenager to Tyndall's popular lantern lectures. I will paraphrase this here. As a boy, Mackinder wrote to Tyndall and was sent a free ticket to a lecture on fluorescence where he, quote, "saw some beautiful experiments." And he says, "I went up to the great man to thank him and he spoke to me kindly. That was my beginning." And as we'll see, the resonance of Tyndall's practice endured in Mackinder's thought and practice. So the continental philosophy and the cumulative work of another secularist scientist, Humboldt, and his cosmos were also imprinted in Kropotkin's thinking. Students should, Kropotkin explained, elaborate the Weltanschauung, the philosophy of the universe. In 1885, he pointed to the significance of the globe and went on to say that this small spot lost amidst an immeasurable space, while showing the variety of mechanical, physical, and chemical agents at work, modifying its surface, setting in motion aerial and aqueous oceans, raising continents and digging abysses, while speaking of the wonderful variety of organic forms and their cooperation and struggles of their admirable adaptations, while describing man in intercourse with nature. And this was a vision that he was able to put into practice during his stint in prison at Clairvaux, where he taught his comrade prisoners this vision of cosmography, geometry, and physics. And similarly, throughout the late 1880s and 1890s, Mackinder's attention was turned to German thought. Physics inspired notions of exchange and integration, thinking dynamically and around. The teaching of the dynamics of geographical, that is human and physical phenomena, was vital to him. In 1895, Mackinder described the ideal geographer as one who can, quote, visualize the play and the conflict of the fluids over and around the solid forms. He can analyze an environment, the local resultant of worldwide systems. He can picture the movements of communities driven by their past history, acting and reacting on the communities around, even visualize the movement of ideas and words as they are carried along the lines of least resistance. So this brings us to another overlap in their thinking. Each perceived geography as the bridging subject between the arts and sciences. For Kropotkin, geography would take its right place if natural science was extended to, quote, man and human societies, in education for a comparative description of all human inhabitants of the earth. And he continued thus, remaining in natural science, it would assume together with history of art, as well as political institutions, the immense task of caring about the humanitarian side of our education. Geographers will tax many kindred sciences in collecting their data, he said. Anthropology, history, philology will be called upon, but it's the true duty of geography to combine in one vivid picture all separate elements of this knowledge. So Mackinder was shaped by the social concerns of mid-1880s Oxford idealism. And from 1887, he envisioned geography as a bridge across what was perceived, after Matthew Arnold and Thomas Henry Huxley, as a widening chasm between the rapidly specializing hard and soft sciences and humanities. Mackinder's famous On the Scope and Methods of Geography paper was an argument for the discipline's physical and political, that is, human, unity. He explained that the geographer might overcome the abyss between the natural sciences and humanities that was responsible for upsetting the equilibrium of our culture. And in that same lecture, he described geography as the science of distribution. We consider what relations hold between the distributions of various sets of features on the Earth's surfaces and what are the causes of those distributions. But I think the similarities and overlaps between the two men are not just theoretical and conceptual, I think they're practical as well. So turning now to think about their teaching methods, I think that that natural philosophy was not only a form of knowledge, but it was also a kind of a model of investigation. And so methodologically, Kropotkin stated that in order to avoid spreading the knowledge of mere words and technical terms, geography and other sciences, quote, must be taught in a series of concentric courses, and that each of them most stress must be laid on those departments which are most comprehensible at different ages. And similarly, in his 1887 Scope and Methods paper, Mackinder's core vision was structured as interpenetrating dynamic dimensional spheres. We presuppose, he said, a knowledge of physiography. We would then start from the idea of a landless globe and build up a conception of the Earth on the analogy of mechanics. Paraphrasing now, he continued, 3 concentric spheroids, the of the atmosphere, hydrosphere, and lithosphere. So that's a sort of a method and a vision, which again surfaces in his 1914 manual, The Teaching of Geography and History. And The imagination was then a tool of learning understood to be common to all humans, and that was celebrated by both men. Kropotkin explained that some modern pedagogues have tried to kill imagination in children. Better ones will understand what a precious auxiliary imagination is to scientific reasoning. And so here again we see a reference to Tyndall's pedagogical practice. Good teaching for Mackinder comprised, quote, the picturing of absent things and movements, some absent in space and some in time, but most in both, and expands and precises a natural power, the power of thinking in the geographical plane. Geographers, he said, should be trained in the power of visualizing forms and movements in space of 3 dimensions, a power difficult of attainment if we are to judge by the frequent use of telluria and models. So for many in the late 19th century, geography was regarded as a drudge, and it was associated with the learning of lists of names and numbers. Debates raged about teaching methods and the risk of children's minds degenerating. These dovetailed with concerns about the cultivation of children's imaginations and use of images.
Excuse me, Emily, you have 5 minutes.
Kropotkin and other anarchists such as Reclus and Paul Robin championed integrated outdoor learning. In his 1885 paper, Kropotkin referred to the RGS exhibition of geographical appliances held that same year. Of paramount significance was the globe. The physics of the globe must be and will be raised to the height of a science, he assured, thereby manifesting his faith in physics and its ability to disclose the laws of the development of the globe. And Mackinder advocated for nature learning too, as in his 1904 The Development of Geography Teaching Out of Nature Study lecture, but he was a pragmatist who vociferously promulgated the use of the optical device of the magic lantern, and even in the era of moving film. In fact, he insisted that it was, quote, wrong to teach the broad matter of geography from anything but a globe. Few schools offered geography classes, fewer possessed or had access to a globe. In 1890, Mackinder conceived of a device, seen here in this sketch, which would come with a number of miniature globes depicting various topographical features, which would enable teachers, quote, the power of turning the globe in any direction and causing the image to rotate correspondingly. As the sketch shows, the device projected an image of a 3-dimensional object onto a screen. Mackinder explained that, quote, the globe is very difficult to use either in a class at school or before a lecture audience. Teachers who understood geography and how to teach with a globe were lacking. Because classroom-sized globes were too small, not all pupils could gather around it and share the same or equal view. Globes, moreover, were bulky, difficult to transport, and expensive. So the advantage of his device was its small scale and power to throw an image of a globe onto a screen. And so his device was designed to overcome the very same problems that Federico Ferretti details teachers having with Reclus spherical maps, which were too small to be seen in the classroom. And by 1903, as the discussion after Reclus' lecture evidences, and after a decade of supporting the Geographical Association for Teachers, Mackinder was conscious of the consequences of that false image early impressed on the mind. Globes had drawbacks. He said, a globe is cumbrous and costly, it cannot be hung on a wall conveniently, it has to stand on a table, it's difficult to use with a class. For teaching, the most valuable adaptation of the globular maps would be to replace for many purposes the globe itself. So I want to wrap up now. So within the context of schooling reforms, Krapotkin alluded to the ethics of geographical education. There's another area of overlap between the two men in their championing of Friedrich Froebel's educational methods. Kropotkin referred to Froebel in the 1885 lecture, but Mackinder in 1906 assumed the presidency of the British Froebel Society which promoted kindergarten teaching methods. And of course, there you see him again advocating for the use of the globe at that point, but also for an integrated primary and secondary education. And it's actually well known that Mackinder's principal contribution to geography was democratizing the subject. He was involved in university outreach lectures, helped to set up the University Extension College at Reading University and the Geographical Association, an organisation that supplied teachers with learning materials. So it's undoubted that he shaped the landscape of geography education in Britain. There are numerous differences which I don't have time to go into now, but I do just want to leave you with one image, and that is that I think a few historiographical lessons come to light from my all too brief talk. Our existing images of Kropotkin, Mackinder, and the Royal Geographical Society are inadequate. The two men, Mackinder and Kropotkin, occupied common physical spaces and intellectual perspectives, and their social networks and friendships were significantly entangled too. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Questions will be made afterwards, and now we can have the presentation of Antonio Ferraz de Oliveira. Please, Antonio, you're on.
Thank you very much, Guilherme. Adrian, can you share my slides? Great. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about Kropotkin's writings on the French Revolution and the kind of rewriting, reimaginations that we can see him do. So next slides, please. So as I've written about in my previous work on Kropotkin's historiography of medieval communes, Kropotkin saw history as a very important field for political activism. And there's this great quote from Fields, Factories and Workshops, where he explains why he sees history as such an important field. He says, history remains a fable convenue, an agreed fable, especially because it wants fresh ideas, and it needs scientific workers to show the life of past centuries. So Kropotkin saw himself as one of these workers, somehow reinterpreting history to give it a proper political function as a point of inspiration for anarchism. So we can see this across Kropotkin's works, both in how he talks about ancient customs, sometimes deemed primitive communism, medieval republics, modern revolutions, such as the French Revolution, and even the history of thought, such as in science, modern science and anarchism. This is part of what Kropotkin is doing when he often speaks about people who are anarchists without knowing it. So next slide, onto the French Revolution. So before we get to Kropotkin's proper writings, it's very important when we talk about the French Revolution to notice the Russian roots of Kropotkin's engagements, preoccupations with the French Revolution. So really this started in Kropotkin's youth when he was 16, in the midst of the great debates in Russia about the great reforms which would abolish the feudal institutions of Russia through imperial mandates. So of course at that time many historians and literary figures debated whether this reform should be done like in the French Revolution, and precisely through which institutional path. Should private property be pursued, or should communal lands remain the property of a village, etc., etc. It was a very active moment of debates. And Kropotkin was involved following these debates very closely and reading many of the Romantic historians, especially French Romantic historians such as Augustin Thierry, but also François Mignet, François Guizot, who argued about this sort of institutional transformations. Of course, as many of you might know, these debates ended in somewhat great disappointment when the universities and the student movement was suppressed and debate was closed. in 1860, and that was the root of many of the nihilist and populist movements in which Kropotkin found himself after returning from Siberia. So Kropotkin's first activism amongst the Tchaikovsky circle, which were revolutionary socialists, is very interesting also for their belief in using reinterpretations of history as a form of propaganda. And we see actually Kropotkin's earliest writings, which unfortunately we don't have in English, on the Pugachev rebellion, written with Lev Tikhomorov, are precisely about trying to retell past insurrections as revolutionary events, actually. And much in the same way, Kropotkin's reinterpretation of Pskov, of the medieval republics, was also a way of trying to get a revolutionary message to the masses. Next slide, please. So that's the Russian roots. As you know, Kropotkin was arrested, escaped in '76, and then went to spend most of his life in between France and Britain, linked to Western socialism. Now, across his very productive and lengthy career as an activist, it's very interesting to see how recurrent his engagement, his reflection with the historical legacy of the French Revolution was. So it is very first big publication, The Words of a Rebel, we see that there's a recurrent reflection and return to the French Revolution, especially in the articles that I put there. The reason why I put 80 and 81 is because that's when the articles were originally written. But as we can see, this reflection continues all the way till he finally publishes The Great Revolution, which coincidentally is his largest book and probably also the least studied, the least understood in a certain sense. Now, next slide, please. Now, it's also very important and interesting to see that in this recurrent concern, there are particular immediate political contexts that motivate Kropotkin to talk once more about the historical legacy of the French Revolution. In 1880 and 81, really what makes Kropotkin want to talk about the French Revolution is the assassination of Tsar Alexander II, as well as the ongoing famines and great turbulence in Russia, not least once his comrades, people from the Tchaikovsky circle and the nihilists, start being persecuted en masse by the Tsarist regime. So this is part of what motivates him in 1881 to talk about an imminent popular insurrection starting from the countryside. So he often will repeat this sentence that Russia is now as France was before 1789. Equally, when he starts writing in 1889 and 1991, he is reacting to two big events: the centenary of the revolution, which was celebrated, as you can imagine, differently depending on your politics in France, but also the coming of the Second International, which also started a series of revisionist readings of the legacy of the French Revolution. Ultimately, of course, when we look at the period of writing of 4 years between 1903 and 1907 that eventually led to the Great Revolution, we know that what was concerning Kropotkin the most was what has been called by historians the First Russian Revolution of 1905. Kropotkin started being preoccupied with it since 1903 with the movements for association of the Zemstva. But it's, actually, if you read the articles instead of the book, it becomes even clearer how much Kropotkin is really trying to think about what's happening in Russia. And even if you look through the Great Revolution, you'll see Russia is one of the most repeated words in a book that is supposedly about, France and Paris mostly. Okay, next slide, please. So those are three very important contexts. Now, let me tell you three kinds of subversions of historiography and sorts of fables, myths, that Kropotkin creates in his readings of the French Revolution, and which have both tried to have a scientific basis, but also very clearly have a political purpose. So I'm going to cover three. There's, of course, more myths that Kropotkin reflects on and have to do with very rich historiography around the French Revolution. But I'm going to talk about the spirit of revolt from 1881, the idea that there were anarchists in the French Revolution, and then finally the sections of Paris. So next slide, please. Can someone just tell me how much time do I still have? Sorry. Yeah, okay, I'm just going to carry on. So the first very interesting engagement that Kropotkin makes on the French Revolution happens in 1881. So in the articles that would would be part of the collection of Paroles, Words of a Rebel, once Kropotkin is in prison in France. And what's very interesting in this is that clearly Kropotkin was moved by two big books that emerge after 1877. One by the conservative historian, but very influential figure in the Third Republic, Hippolyte Taine, who did a series on the origins of modern France. And his first title on the French Revolution was called The Anarchy. And of course, Kropotkin was immediately attracted to this title. And I'll explain his reaction later. But the second one was also a far less known book called The Revolutionary Spirit Before the Revolution by Félix Roquin, written in the same year as Taine. And this was the one that Kropotkin saw as a more scientific book and referred to for many years to come. So you can find in Mutual Aid, in the Great Revolution, this reference continues. So there's two big ideas that Kropotkin took from these two books. One from Roquin was really the idea that the French Revolution was about to happen, was about to blow up for, about 40 years before it actually happened. And this was, as Kropotkin saw it, through popular insurrections, often driven by hunger or by the destruction of communal rights in the countryside in France. And this made Kropotkin very hopeful of the potential for future revolutions around the world. The second thing, which was very important then, besides the idea that 40 years, 50 years of riots might mean a revolution is imminent, was also the idea that the French Revolution actually was made by a sort of permanent insurrection on the countryside and in the towns and cities. And this was an idea he actually took from Taine. So Taine, as a conservative, of course, liked to emphasize anarchy as the disorder. He liked to present the French Revolution as coming out of immense turmoil in the countryside and lots of thieves killing lords on the road and things like this. Well, Kropotkin reverted this idea and he said, the French Revolution only went so far because popular insurrections did, in direct action, what parliaments later tried to accomplish in law and curtail. So this really establishes the significance of direct action. And as you can see in 1881, Kropotkin is constantly relating these messages to the agrarian question, to peasant riots in Russia and in Ireland as well. So already with an eye to the English questions too. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the next very interesting fable that Kropotkin creates is in 1891. So in the context of his reflections about these centenary revisions of the legacies of the French Revolution. And very, very interestingly, this comes out of reading François Mignet, who is a historian that lived through the French Revolution and who Kropotkin talks about already in his letters to Alexander in the 1850s. So Kropotkin probably knew Mignet's work for quite some time. But what Kropotkin wanted to show in this period of the 1890s was that the middle classes and their political leaders did not really have historical responsibility for the revolution. So in one of his articles on the centenary, he says explicitly that Michelet, Mignet, and Louis Blanc's histories have spread the glory of a spirit of revolt, but they've also misled people to think that it was parliamentary leaders rather than popular leaders who made the revolution happen. So that was his driving idea. Now, again, Kropotkin plays on the fact that in Mignet's history, he quotes Brissot, the leader of the Girondins, as speaking about certain extreme parts of the left in Paris as anarchists. And so Brissot, when the Girondins were leading the French Revolution in 1971, was calling for these anarchists, these popular leaders, to be executed, to be guillotined. And Kropotkin sort of once again inverts the accusation of anarchism and says, actually, yes, these were anarchists. We ought to see these people that liberal historians accuse as glorious ancestors to our tradition. Right? And he really builds on Brissot's pamphlets to make that myth. And in a sense, this is why in certain documentary histories of anarchism today, people speak about Jacques Roux or Varlet as anarchists. Whilst, as contemporary historians, we might say this isn't quite correct, but we get the thing he's trying to do. And of course, there's a polemical effect to these efforts, which is saying, do not believe in the rising social democracy of the 1890s. They will fail revolutionary movements. They will defend property rather than popular initiative. And in fact, Kropotkin also goes back to 1871 to the Paris Commune and says they also failed the Paris Commune. And it was because they didn't let popular initiative go through that the Paris Commune failed. Okay, next slides. So finally, to our last myth that Kropotkin makes out of the French Revolution. And this is a myth that he makes really in his quite late writings about the French Revolution, and that come out of his immersement in a lot of documentary history that's being made about the French Revolution by the school of Hollard and the Society of Studies for the French Revolution. And he finds this little pamphlet by someone called Ernest Meillet, who talks about the sections of Paris and the way in which after not 1972, 1792. Sorry, the date is mistaken there in the slide. So he points to the fact at how popular initiative in Paris was really what saved the revolution from being closed down by Girondins in 1791, when they were calling for the heads of popular leaders and when they wanted to defend property and curtail the excesses of the revolution. So Kropotkin says, actually, this is the golden moment of the French Revolution, is the 10th of August of 1792, when the streets take over the initiative from the parliaments and start in a spectacular, for a year, in a spectacular display of popular initiative, start taking autonomy over all parts of city life. And even at the beginning of the Revolutionary Wars, Kropotkin insists it's this initiative, popular initiative, that ensures France is saved. Diz Guilherme.
I think we are close to 2 minutes. I don't know why
Okay.
the measurement is not on, but I think we are close to the end.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. Até neste sorry, now in Portuguese. Even in this context, it's very interesting to see that Kropotkin still came back to the first generation of Romantic historians, such as François Mignet, but also Michelet, to talk about how the beginning of Jacobin terror destroyed this popular initiative. So he refers to Michelet's comments on how Paris went quiet once the leaders of the Hébertistes were guillotined by Robespierre's initiative. Equally, he picks on a comment that Mignet makes in a negative way, saying that the hopes of the French Revolution were to lead to an extreme municipalism opposed to parliamentary dictatorship and defending the most extreme democracy. And he presents this comment, which was once a negative thing by Mignet, as a positive thing. Yes, this was the true objective. Of course, as you might notice, because all these comments are written after 1907, they are after mutual aid. So they also connect with the efforts that Kropotkin has made in mutual aid to talk about communal institutions. And there's a very interesting dialogue he has with a Belgian international lawyer, Ernest Nies, that is part of this last effort of fabulations in Kropotkin's thinking. Okay, next slide. So that's a bunch of history in a very short time, and I hope I haven't bored you. Some conclusions that we can see out of these fabulations, these myths that Kropotkin creates to do with the French Revolution. He wants to legitimize three key ideas: that a permanent popular insurrection is necessary for the revolution to happen. He says, in France, it took 4 years of constant insurrection for feudalism to be abolished. There's no other way. We're going to do things differently now. Second, he wants to say, do not trust liberal or left-leaning parliamentarians. They fear the people. At the end of the day, they fear the people. They fear the masses. And lastly, he reinstores this hope that actually if you just allow popular initiative, there will be new forms of communism that will spring out of this revolutionary moment with a creativity that will create new forms of society. Okay? In this exercise, as I have tried to show, what's very interesting is not only how Kropotkin brings anarchist ideas to reinterpret French history or the history of the French Revolution, but also how he very cleverly subverts the historiography of liberal historians and conservative historians to say that the facts that they refer to supply Kropotkin's own position. So that's it from me. Next slide. Thank you very much for listening, and please do get in touch. And if you're curious about this sort of approach, read my latest articles. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. Very interesting presentation. And now we have Federico Ferretti talking aloud the presentation of what's his name again? Sergey Saytanov. Yeah, the All-Russian Public Committee for the Perpetuation of the Memory of P.A. Krapotkin.
Thank you, Guilherme, and thank you, Emily and Antonio, for these fantastic papers. So I am reading the text sent by our colleague and friend from Moscow, Sergey Saytanov, who cannot attend. Only I have first to apologize with the public because I will not be able to respond questions on this text because it is a text written by someone else on a research that is not my research, an approach that is not my approach. But in any case, if you have questions for Sergey, drop it to the email of the conference and I will be happy to forward to him. I can also share some links to the former Kropotkin Museum in Moscow in the chat. So the first attempt to create the All-Russian Public Committee for the Perpetuation of the Memory of P.A. Kropotkin was made on February 17, 1921, by the Commission for the Arrangement of Pyotr Kropotkin funeral. This commission proposed its candidates to the anarchists. The temporary committee formed to perpetuate the memory of Pyotr Kropotkin included 8 people: Kropotkin's widow, Sofia Kropotkina, and daughter Alexandra Kropotkina, Vera Figner, the oldest Russian revolutionary and friend of Pyotr Kropotkin, also received an invitation to join it. However, already at the first meetings of the committee, disagreements arose on the one hand between Vera Figner and Sofia Kropotkina, who advocated the open character of the committee, and on the other hand, the rest of the anarchists, who sought to create a political anarchist center from the Committee for the Perpetuation of the Memory of Pyotr Kropotkin. As a result, Figner and Krapotkina left the first committee, and in June 1921, a new initiative group was formed around them, which included the anarchists I.M. Atabekian, A.A. Karelin, N.K. Lebedev, and the chairman of the Russian Technical Society, P.I. Palchinsky. As a result, on June 20, this group sent an appeal to various anarchist, scientific, and public organizations. It proposed expanding the EOK on the basis of several actions, each of which would independently study the side of Pyotr Kropotkin's activity in which it was most competent. On this principle, on September 18, 1921, a new All-Russian Public Committee for the Perpetuation of the Memory of Pyotr Kropotkin, APC, was formed. The second APC initially consisted of 2 sections, anarchist and scientific, but subsequently it was supposed to open also the socio-economic, literary, artistic, and bibliographic section. The main tasks of the new committee were the organization of the Kropotkin Museum in Moscow, the promotion of various aspects of its activities, the publication of a bulletin in 4 languages, collection and works of Pyotr Kropotkin himself. Members of the APC could only be representatives of those institutions, organizations, and groups whose task, quote, and activity do not contradict the basic principle or ideas of P.A. Kropotkin, end of quote. Funds for these activities were to come to the APC from voluntary contributions from organizations, groups, and individuals wishing to do on terms acceptable to the committee, and income from publications, lectures, and similar activities of the committee. The new APC included both anarchists of various strands and former populists, from whom Vera Figner and Pyotr Kropotkin once emerged. Figner, like Kropotkin, participated in the 80s-70s in the populist movement in Russia. Like Kropotkin, Figner, not accepting the Bolshevik coup, withdrew from political activity, focusing on public organizations. Members of the committee were Honorary Chairman Pyotr Kropotkin's widow, Sofia Kropotkina, Chairman Vera Figner, Deputy Chairman Alexei Borovoy, Secretary Nikolai Lebedev, Treasurer A.P. Rostlowski. The APC was headed by the Executive Bureau of the APC, elected on 6 November 1921, chaired by Vera Figner. And the committee itself also included representatives of the Museum of the Revolution, the Central Geographical Museum, the Russian Bibliographic Society, the Russian Geographical Society, the Geological Committee, the Pushkin Society, the Tolstoy Museum, the publishing houses, Zadruga, Golostruda, and a number of other organizations. Some anarchists still tried to turn the APC into the center of the anarchist movement. By the widow of Pyotr Kropotkin and those close to her, insisted on the public, non-partisan nature of the created organizations, since they well understood the impossibility of such a step under the conditions of the Bolshevik dictatorship in Russia. Therefore, the committee confirmed that it does not require its members to practice their anarchist or any other, between quotes, creed, but the committee sets only one condition, quote, that the activities of the member and sections of the committee would not contradict the principles and idea of Krapotkin. This made it possible to include in the committee representatives of many scientific and cultural organizations, museums, scientific societies, publishing houses, educational and research institutes, prominent figures of science and culture. In the autumn of 1921, the Executive Bureau of the Committee began to create the Pyotr Kropotkin Museum. Even earlier, by the decision of the Moscow Soviet of February 15, 1921, the Bolshevik authorities allowed to transfer Out 26 in Moscow to the Pyotr Kropotkin Museum in Kraposkinsky Lane, Building 26. Pyotr Kropotkin was born in this house. MP Shebalin became the manager and custodian of the funds. And on December 9, 1923, the museum was opened on the birthday of Pyotr Kropotkin. The history of the museum in the 1920s represented a series of conflicts between anarchist groups and the museum leadership. The anarchist section of the APC was one of the last legally existing anarchist organizations in the USSR. However, it was precisely this aspect of the APC's activity that was the least successful. Moreover, it was the main source of internal conflicts in the life of the committee. On the one hand, these conflicts occurred as a result of interfactional struggle in the anarchist section. On the other hand, they were caused by the attempts of a part of the anarchists to oppose other members of the APC, since they considered themselves to be the exclusive ideological heirs of Pyotr Kropotkin. Meanwhile, there were other contenders for the legacy of Pyotr Kropotkin in Soviet Russia. He was considered the oldest Russian revolutionary and leader of Russian anarchism at the beginning of the 20th century. But the views of Krapotkin were perceived apparently as quite moderate, and the leader of the Bolsheviks, Vladimir Ulyanov Lenin, used Kropotkin, between many quotes, reformism, as a very convenient justification for the historical continuity of the power of the Bolsheviks, who practically appeared out of nowhere and seized power in Russia. As Lenin believed, he, Pyotr Kropotkin, is still valuable to us and dear to all us, all his wonderful past and the works that he did. End of quote from Lenin. The head of the Soviet government insisted on the publication and study of the works of Pyotr Kropotkin, according to the recollections of closest assistant and de facto secretary of Lenin, Vladimir Bonch-Bruyevich, but at the same time, quote, with all sorts of notes that need to be made so that the reader understands the difference between petty bourgeois anarchism and the truly communist worldview of revolutionary Marxism, end of quote. Therefore, on the one hand, Lenin was very interested in perpetuating the memory of Pyotr Kropotkin, but only such a memory that was beneficial for the new regime of power. On the other hand, Lenin was also interested in strengthening supervision and control over Russian anarchists. These former political allies of the Bolsheviks, who played a possible decisive role in the overthrow of Kerensky's socialist government in October 1917, were too headstrong and explosive. Now the Bolsheviks saw in the anarchists a direct threat to their power. Control over the anarchists could ensure precisely the unification of all Russian anarchists into a common organization transparent to the Bolsheviks. Moreover, such an organization should not be exclusively anarchist and exclusively politically. It was too dangerous. It seemed to us that at the initial stage, an attempt to create an APC declared by the anarchists themselves could well correspond to such a goal, and the Bolsheviks took advantage of this opportunity, using the APC blindly. Indeed, the anarchists who remained after the Bolshevik repression were grouped around the Pyotr Kropotkin Museum, which helped the authorities to register them. As a meeting place for anarchists, the museum was from the very beginning under the hood of the Soviet Special Services. Since the APC was created as an exclusively public organization not directly controlled by the Soviet government, the Bolsheviks did not need to finance the committee either, and from the very beginning the committee existed on self-sufficiency, hoping that financial independence from the state would allow it to maintain both internal independence and freedom. Forced to seek funds for the renovation of the Pyotr Kropotkin Museum and the activities of the committee, the APC developed the plan to collect funds from Europe and America. The influx of some funds from England, where the Committee for the Promotion of the Krapotkin Museum was formed with the participation of Bernard Shaw and Herbert Wells, and from America allowed the museum committee to renovate all the rooms of the Kropotkin house. In addition, thanks to the great help of the British Committee for Assistance to the Museum, in 1925, Sofia Krapotkina was able to bring from England the library, archive, and furnishings of Pyotr Kropotkin studies that remained there. Sofia Krapotkina transferred a large number of materials taken from Brighton to the museum, but she kept some of her personal use in the house of Dimitrov, where Pyotr Kropotkin died. But attacks on the, between quotes, social activists of the APC were not the only context of the activities of the section. The first serious crisis between the anarchists and the leadership of the APC occurred in 1925. Members of the anarchist section often promoted anarchist ideas. By that time, the anarchist section, led by A.M. Atabekian and others, already twice a week conducted its classes in the library reading room of the museum under open doors. On their initiative, within the framework of the APC, the Black Cross acted, an organization of assistance to imprisoned anarchists and their
2 minutes, Ferretti.
Yeah, the Black Cross was headed by a 4-member secretariat. Fund for this work consisted of private donation, income from charity lotteries and concerts, and income for foreign anarchist organization. So as I have only 2 minutes and a couple of pages to read, I take the freedom to summarize the conclusion of Sergey. Basically, he analyzes the end of this museum at the end of the 1930s. Basically, the Soviet regime at a certain moment decide to dismember the materials of this museum, and obviously not everything could be rescued, and now the only institution which displays some collections from the Krapotkin families in Dimitrov, so the house museum of Krapotkin. Here Sergey makes a point that he considered that anarchist activism was, he says, too extremist, so too unacceptable to the Bolshevik regime in the USSR, with, it seems, also a critique to these activists, but for what also I gather, he agrees that anyway there is no kind of extremism that can justify totalitarianism and political repression. In fact, Sergey concludes, I quote again from him, that in fact totalitarianism never had anything to do with either anarchism or socialism, and even more so with communism. I will send some informative links of this on this museum on the chat. Thank you also on behalf of Sergey.
Thank you, Ferretti. Thanks, Sergey, for this story of the Krapotkin Museum fight against the Bolsheviks. And now we have the talk of Xavier HALLEZ. I am a man on the Muslim anarchist in Russia. You are free to talk, Javier, please.
Okay, hello. So I will share my presentation. So just to do it, share screen. Here. I think you got it. Is it okay for the sharing of my screen? So I will begin. So hello, dear colleagues. I will talk today about my paper, which is called I Am a Man, on the anarchist influence among Muslims in Russia before 1917. The purpose of this paper is to bring forward a part of the political history largely ignored in the work on Muslims in Russia at the beginning of the 20th century. The religious side is always emphasized due to a self-definition given by the stakeholder related to Islam, but which use was understood in the sense of the national questions. Russian and non-Russian population, especially Muslims, were clearly separated, even in their political organization. However, it becomes evident that the vigor and the multiplicity of revolutionary thoughts and action in Russia, most often related to forms of socialism, had an impact on Muslim movements. My objective is to explore the influence of anarchist ideas among Muslims in the Russian Empire during the years that followed the 1905 revolution and the wave of anarchist activism. This work focuses on Mesa Galiev, a Tatar revolutionary who became the main Muslim representative of the Bolshevik Party after 1918. My paper will present Sultan Galiev's revolutionary career before 1917, stressing on political references. The development of political thought is difficult to trace due to the lack of sources. Sultan Galiev's autobiography, written in 1923, is the main source, and the contextualization of the references given by him helps to draw this evolution. In an article published in Slovo, a review by Inalco, there is some translation of extract of this autobiography in French that I made with commentaries. Mir Said Sultan Galiev was born in 1892 in a village of the Ufa region in the Russian Empire. So here you see on the right side, it's the Ufa gubernia in 1892, and Ufa is in the middle. His father was a Muralim, a Muslim teacher in a village school. He had a small library, including a number of classics of Russian literature, and Sultan Galiev made his first readings there. His father's wish was for him to enter a Russian school, but there were no scholarship for Muslims. As a result, Sultan Galiev entered the Medrese, Quranic school of Sterlitamak in 1903. So as you see on the map on the left, you have Sterlitamak, which is on the south of which is actually the Republic of Bashkir in Russia. So where he studies until 1907, so in the Medrese of Sterlitamak. At the Sterlitamak Medrese, teaching was influenced by the Jadid reform. So the Jadid were Muslims, modernist reformers within the Russian Empire in the late 19th and early 20th century. Jadids maintained that Muslims in the Russian Empire had entered a period of decay that could only be rectified by the acquisition of a new kind of knowledge and modernist European modeled cultural reform. Jadids advocated the introduction of a modern educational system as a prerequisite for social change and cultural revitalization. They criticized also the traditional social order and specifically the injustice against women. Sultan Galiev was thus brought up in a moderate Muslim and Tatar circle. But in 1907, Sultan Galiev entered the Kazan Normal Primary School. So Kazan was one of the big university city in Russia, intending to become a teacher. In his autobiography of 1923, he mentioned two Tatar teachers who have introduced him to socialism, and one of them had participated in the 1905 revolution. They made him read books and socialist brochures, but this reading remained limited. So here you see the works cited by Sultan Galiev, where there is 2 unspecified writing by Pyotr Kropotkin. Socialist ideas were widely disseminated at this time and had an influence on all political movements. They had permeated national movements emerging throughout the Russian Empire and were not seen as contradictory to religious views. For Sultan-Galiev, this year of study in Kazan nevertheless corresponded to a fundamental change. As he said, at 16, so it was in 1908, I was already a true atheist. It was also during this period that he became a reader of the magazine Жизнь для всех, Life for All, published from 1908 and closed in 1918 by the Cheka, the political police of the Bolshevik. This legal magazine was run by socialists of various orientation. So the chief editor was Vladimir Pose, which was a social democrat, but not in the move of the Bolshevik. And here also we got Mikhail Novorusky, was a former member of the famous Narodnaya Volya and convicted of an assassination attempt on Alexander III. And he was responsible for the political column in this magazine. Generally speaking, the journal was known to promote in disguised form, because of censorship, anarchist ideas like federalism, unionism, cooperatives, and anti-militarism. Sultan-Galiev places great emphasis on the importance of this journal in his political and personal development. Graduated in 1911, Sultan-Galiev had various experiences as a teacher and in administration responsible for the education of Muslim populations, but where very quickly he wanted to turn away from teaching. In one of his first articles from 1912, he wrote, "Also, I respect and love the teaching profession. I cannot get used to the condition to practice it. That's why I often think it will be so good to go to university and take up some other activity." He deplored the material difficulties and the submission to the administration. We, the teachers, found ourselves in the position of slaves, and moreover of poor slaves. One of Krapotkin's texts, which is probably one of those to which Sultan-Galiev refers, seems to respond to his questioning. It's an appeal to the young, which had a very important echo throughout the Russian Empire and beyond. This few extracts testifies it. So if you are a man, it's very if you are a man, if every sentiment is translated in your case into an action of the will, if in you the beast has not crushed the intelligent being, then you will return home one day saying to yourself, "No, it is unjust. This must go on any longer." That very day you will understand socialism. And this part, which is very relevant for this paper. "And what shall I say to the schoolmaster? You will wish to have wide human education for all, in school and out of school, and saying that this is impossible in existing condition. You will attack the very foundation of bourgeois society, then discharged as you will be by the education department, you will leave your school and come among us and be of us. You will tell men of reaper years, but of smaller attainment than yourself, how enticing knowledge is, what mankind ought to be, nay, what we could be. You will come and work with socialists for the complete transformation of the existing system. Will strive side by side with us to attain true equality, real fraternity, never-ending liberty for the world. You cannot remain neutral. You will come and take the side of the oppressed, because you know that the beautiful, the sublime, the spirit of life itself are on the side of those who fight for light, for humanity, for justice." Sultan-Galiev thus became more and more involved in journalism, which more closely matches his personal and political ambition. From 1911 to 1915, Sultan-Galiev was a regular correspondent of several newspapers. He did not, however, contribute to the main Muslim newspaper in Russia. His writings were published in the local Ufa press. He is particularly vindicative there against corruption and manifestation of religious fanaticism. More significantly, in 1913, he began writing for the St. Petersburg newspaper Musulmanskaya Gazeta, the Muslim newspaper, which existed from 1912 to 1914. The guideline of this newspaper was expressed in this word in the first issue. So about 20 million Muslims live in the Russian Empire, and it will be no wonder that if they come out of darkness and the path of ignorance there, they now desire to have a proper place in the life of state. Will we continue, and do we still have the right to sleep? No, no, and 1,000 times no. We will cry out, call, and challenge all our sleeping brothers to bring them to the culture, to the new life.
Excuse me, Javier, you have 5 minutes.
Okay. The cited newspaper is often presented as pan-Islamist in historiography, but its chief editors affirmed socialist ideas, approved the terrorist attacks were then on in Russia, and denounced the existence of pan-Islamism in Russia. Sultan Galiev's articles, which appeared in this newspaper, are distinguishable from its other publication, both in style and subject. It is fueled by the revolt against injustice in its broad sense, and these questions in Kropotkin's address to the young people, which had such a strong resonance. What meaning should one give to one's life in an unequal society, and how should one act to change it? Also, the theme of the woman condition was recurrent in Tatar and socialist publication, and Sultan Galiev published some articles on the subject where his point was to stress the necessity to give the freedom of choice to women for their professional and private life. One of the articles Sultan Galiev published in 1914 in Musulmanskaya Gazeta entitled I Am a Man, Человек, expressed a relationship to the world close to the one in Manifesto and Russian anarchist text. If I were Hormuz, I would open people's eyes on the falsehood of Hormuz the usurper, and thus I would have ended the ubiquitous falsehood. I would have created a man who would be himself. The man Hormuz would have then turned away from its two centenarians foes, the usurper Hormuz and Ahriman, and metamorphosed into a human being, and Hormuz man would then cry, back the divine, back the satanic, I need what I am, humanity, but I am not Hormuz, I'm a man. And here is the Yekaterinodar Manifesto of Anarchist Communists, which declared in 1909, the power, the capital kill everything that is free, proud and luminous in the man. We anarchist communists want to disperse the darkness and the fog to achieve the complete fulfillment of the individual. This speech is addressed to you, our brother worker. Wake up, look around you. Remember that you are a man, Человек. This manifesto begins and ends on the following sentence by Bakunin: the passion for destruction is a creative passion too. This relationship with nature is at the heart of his thoughts. For Sultan Galiev, man must take the measure of its weakness in the face of nature. He is subject to his laws. Give me back my life. Do not put me away from nature, from existence. His political activity began in 1913, while he was working in Ufa during the summer. There he met Tatar and Bashkir teachers, with whom he was able to share his own political reflections. The most influential for Sultan Galiev was Girey Kadrachev, an anarchist Bashkir. Older than him, Kadrachev had been close to various anarchist groups since 1905, but he was apparently not affiliated with any organization in 1913. The repressions against the anarchist movement after 1907 were very strong, and in many towns, anarchist groups had disappeared. Sultan Galiev and Kadrachev, joined by two other teachers, Bogdanov and Valiev, would have formed a Tatar socialist fighting organization in the summer of 1913. And the idea was to create, at that time, a Tatar anarchist organization.
Excuse me,
program
Javier,
was,
2 minutes.
2 minutes,
now.
yeah? Okay. Their program was classic. So the overthrow of tribalism to establish a democratic republic, the transfer of land from wealthy landowners to peasants and factory to workers, and which is, a sense for Muslims, regional national self-determination. Their first action was the distribution of a leaflet criticizing the Russification of the Bashkir and the Tatar induced by the educational policy. They denounced the appointment of the Muslim villages of the Ufa gubernia of Russian and baptized Tatar teachers. The leaflet was distributed by Sultan Galiev to school teachers and Jadid mullahs. According to Sultan Galiev, the leaflet would have had important repercussion. In many villages, the offending teachers were reportedly dismissed. Their organization issued another noticeable proclamation. Written after the declaration of war of 1914, it called on Muslim soldiers to desert, explaining that the Russians, non-content with having enslaved the Tatar, Bashkirs, Turkestani, and Caucasians, were now seeking to conquer the Turks and Persians. The speech was both anti-colonial and anti-militarist. At the end of the summer of 1914, the group handed out the proclamation within the Stelitamak garrison, and a revolt was said to have taken place there. Their group remained very marginal and had no connection with the local Bolshevik organization. The separation of Russian and Muslim population was a real barrier to common action and equal relationships. Bolshevik and many other revolutionary organizations didn't take into account the specific demands of Muslims. On the other hand, the main Tatar or Bashkir national movement were too liberal and moderate for them. The mobilization shattered their organization. Kadrachev was mobilized and left for the front, as well as Valiev. Bogdanov refused to be enlisted and managed to hide in a village. And Sultan Galiev then left for Baku in the Caucasus, where he managed to find a job in a newspaper thanks to an anarchist network. After 1917, Sultan Galiev joined the liberal Muslim national movement for a while, before joining the Bolshevik party like many anarchists. He never defines himself as a truly anarchist, but the repeated references in his 1923 autobiography show the influence of anarchism in his political formation. In 1918, he tried to create an autonomous Muslim Communist Party and was, at a time in the 1950s, presented as the father of the idea of the Third World. Thank you for your attention.
Close to the end. All right.
Yeah,
that's
the end.
Okay, people. So now we have the talk of José Antonio Gutierrez, Violence and the Sociology of the Modern State, from Kropotkin to Tilly. Please, José. Sorry.
Yes, I'm going to unmute myself. Thank you very much, and putting me at the very end of such a good stream of papers and so cleverly produced research. You know, it's obviously feels very, very challenging, but I will try to do my best not to become the sour cherry of the cake. So, my paper now will deal mostly with one aspect of Kropotkin, which I think has been insufficiently explored in academic research. We have all heard that unlike Marxism, anarchism does not have the same length or width of intellectual of an intellectual tradition. And obviously, the very fact that we are celebrating this conference today, this colloquium today, I mean, for the whole week, it's proved that is it's an insufficiently grounded statement, often made without properly understanding or engaging actually with the anarchist intellectual tradition. And Kropotkin was indeed himself one of the most vibrant, dynamic, better published, and above all, most influential intellectuals of his own time. And unfortunately, although he was very influential at this time, I think that we have not, in retrospective, used to the full extent the wealth and the richness of the insights and some of Kropotkin's research that was done 100 years ago. He set up the base for a number of disciplines, okay, and he was very influential, of course, as we've been discussing here, for a number of disciplines, including history and geography. But I want to talk today about an aspect of Kropotkin which is not has the same let's say the attention it should get as it deserves, which is Kropotkin as a sociologist of the state. Okay, the sociology of the state has a long and very respectable history. It spans from the end of the 19th century. But what I want to do is to show that Kropotkin contributions at the time were critical, that Kropotkin contributions were influential, but they were, I don't know, and I cannot assure if they were deliberately or not acknowledged by some intellectuals that were discussing these issues at the time. But most certainly, I think it is well overdue that he gets a recognition in terms of his insights in the light of recent developments, and recently in the last 4 decades, recent developments in the sociology of state, and particularly with the editions of sociology such as Charles Tilly, Michael Mann, Thomas Erdmann, and of course we can think of a few more, but those are the first names that come to mind. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do in this short presentation is to situate Kropotkin debate into the context in which he's writing. Okay, at the time that Kropotkin is writing, it's a time where there's a high faith in progress. Okay, we're talking the end of the 19th century. We're talking about sociology as being a way to understand. Sociology is being formed as a discipline. Okay, that's the time in which the intellectual production of Marx, Durkheim, and a bit later Weber, we're talking considering in a way the holy trinity of sociological thinking, are starting to write and come up with their more substantial contributions to the development of this. Okay, Krobotkin is writing exactly at the same time, although his interests are in a way a bit harder to pin down in specific disciplines, and he is far more of a naturalist in terms of his spirit. That leaps from history to social sciences, then to nature, and he does that with great skill. And that doesn't mean that he is eclectic in his approach. He's actually very consistent, and we're going to come back to that. And I think that Antonio made a wonderful work in terms of setting the stage for this very presentation, in terms of dealing with some of his intellectual concerns, some of his contributions. Okay. So at the time sociology is developing, and sociology, it's taking shape by the contribution of this holy trinity, as I say. There's a few issues that became dominant in terms of reflections in this early sociological tradition. One of them was, of course, and quite naturally, the fact of human progress. Okay, they were all writing from the perspective of human progress, and Kropotkin was no exception to that. And I'm going to again come back to this. Okay, now there was one issue, okay, which never received enough sociological attention, and Sinisa Malesevic argues that it was probably because it was considered to be an atavistic relic of previous times, or because it really had no explanation in the future progress of society, which is warfare. Okay, warfare and conquest receive scant attention from this holy trinity. Okay, warfare is not considered fully as a phenomenon of research in its own right by neither Marx, Durkheim, or Weber, although Marx would tend to use a very warlike language to describe class struggle, class warfare, as he refers to it sometimes, as violence being the how do you call it? Some English word escaped me, but to be the midwife of history. Okay, and in Weber we find exactly the same. You see the whole definition of state, the classic definition of the sociological definition of state, done by Weber, the great leveler, of course. I mean, it's been pointed by Antonio, of course. All that language was very bellicose, very belligerent, and the same happens with Weber. Weber talks about the state not as a social contract that Rousseau spoke about, but he talks about the state as the expression, the institutional expression of legitimate violence. Okay, how violence became to be legitimate, in his view, is not that it's necessarily positive or benign. It means that it's sanctioned by a set of institutions that makes it basically legal, okay, and legally binding, and producing some element of consensus from the dominator on the subject. Okay, that's more or less his definition. But violence is central as well. However, warfare as such escapes the systematic analysis from this Holy Trinity. Now, there were some other sociologies at the time which were, for good or bad, but they were forgotten by time, particularly after the experience of two disastrous wars, as the Great War first and then the Second World War. Okay, because a lot of sociologists at the time used deliberately not only a belligerent language, but they were quite enthusiastic about war as such and about the power of the state. And I'm talking about people like Ludwig Gumplowicz, I'm talking about Ratzenhofer, I'm talking about Leslie Ward, Albion Small. It was not only the Pareto, Mosca. So it was not just the Austro-Hungarians who were very militaristic and very Prussian in their sort of militaristic approach. That spread to the United States, that spread to Italy, and there was a number of social scientists at the time that made the link between war and the origins of the modern state, but in rather unsavory terms, in terms that could be seen as totalitarian, could be seen as enthusiastic of militaristic discipline, and that were actually quite bound by a number of racial theories. Okay, for instance, Ratzenhofer described human progress in terms of what he called a Rassenkampf. Okay, in German, a race struggle, in which the lesser races were to be subjective and colonized. And he had also a normative dimension about it. It was not seen as problematic. It was seen as actually a process of civilization in ways not too different as in which Marx referred at the time to the US war with Mexico or to the British conquest of India. It has to be said, okay? That imperialist kind of perspective was pretty much there at the time, and a number of these passages made it very unsavory to quote these sociologists in perspective after the horrors, of course, of Nazi Germany and the Second World War. Okay, in the case, for instance, of Sumner, another sociologist of the time, he actually said that war was society's version of the natural selection. So obviously the strongest would survive and the lesser would be colonized. They would become subjects and so on and so forth. And that was considered to be actually not only morally okay, but it was considered to be beneficial for the progress of society at the time. Okay. Now Kropotkin took some of those discussions that were happening at the time, but he put it in a thank you very much. It seemed to be. It seems that you're picking on me and you're giving me less time than with the others. But I'm not going to make a compliment. I'm joking. I'm not serious on this. I'll just try to synthesize here. Okay. Kropotkin at the time made a brilliant contribution in terms of linking the development of the state to warfare. Okay, and linking it to more than even physical violence, more to the act of conquest, which is prominent in his work in terms of the Roman tradition. And I'm going to come back to that in 3 minutes, but also in terms of structural violence, in terms of how the whole legal and the whole institutional arrangement produce subjection. So he links this idea of violence to the state, but he strips it of this sort of normative and civilizing overtones, which is quite an interesting thing. Many years later, this same exercise was done by a number of sociologists of the state, in particular Charles Tilly, Michael Mann, Anthony Giddens, John Hall, Sidney Tarrow. Okay, they all revisit this idea of Gumplowicz, of conquest theory of the state coming out of conquest, coming out of warfare, but they strip it of its militaristic and totalitarian undertones. Okay, They develop a further element, which I think links quite a lot with what Kropotkin already observed 100 years ago, which is the idea of resistance as critical to the development of some guarantees and a system of mutual obligations or responsibilities. Resistance as being the basis of a concept of citizenship, okay? But the thinking of all of these sociologists by linking state to violence, it's rather pessimistic, okay? And in that sense, it diverges significantly from Kropotkin's view. And I'm going to quote here, literally Charles Steele, okay, who says in his classic book on capital accumulation and state building in Western Europe, he says, the tragic fact is simple. Coercion works. Those who apply substantial force to their fellows get compliance, and from that compliance draw the multiple advantages of money, goods, deference, access to pleasures denied to less powerful people. Okay, so this let's say this pessimistic approach actually permeates these ideas, in spite of the discovery of how fruitful resistance can be. Okay, why do I think it is important to revisit the idea of state in Kropotkin, which has been outlined in his work, the state historical role in the mutual aid and also in the Great French Revolution, which will save me to go through all of that because Antonio's presentation gave already a very good summary of it. But I think that there's two main elements in terms of why it's necessary from a sociological point of view to recover Kropotkin's theory of the state. The first one is because although it might be in terms of its facts and figures a bit dated, because obviously he was writing 120 years ago, before a number of progress have been made in terms of history and sociology. Still, the insight was quite right. And again, I'm going to quote the state historical role of Kropotkin. I'm going to quote it textually because this became very, very, very influential. He understood in the origin of the state two traditions. Okay, a popular tradition and an imperial tradition. Okay, in the case of Europe, he associated the popular tradition with so-called barbarians and the imperial tradition with the Romans. Okay, and he writes, throughout the history of our civilization, two traditions, two opposing tendencies have confronted each other: the Roman and the popular, the imperial and the federalist, the authoritarian and the libertarian. And this is so once more on the eve of the social revolution. Between these two currents, always manifesting themselves, always at grips with each other, the popular trend and that which thirsts for political and religious domination, we have made our choice. We seek to recapture the spirit which drove people in the 12th century to organize themselves on the basis of free agreement and individual initiative, as well as of the free federation of the interested parties. And we are quite prepared to leave to others to climb to the imperial, the Roman, and the canonical tradition. Okay. Kropotkin understood these two traditions, and this has been proved in hindsight to be quite an astute approach. Not only Bookchin and Abdallah Öcalan take this in their later works, but actually a critical sociologist of state formation, Thomas Ehrman, he recognized in his book Birth of Leviathan in 1997 that the uneven legacies of the Roman Empire in Europe accounted for different levels of popular participation in different political systems. Okay, and that speaks very well of this absolutely astute and revolutionary view of Krapotkin 120 years ago, which I think should be recovered. And I'm going to finish, because I'm aware my time is up, by saying that there's another positive element in this. So the contribution of Kropotkin was not purely academic. It was also far-reaching in terms that he's not only happy in giving a diagnosis as most contemporary sociologists of state and recognizing that state and violence are linked, but he also goes beyond in terms of trying to figure out and work a more inclusive, more egalitarian, more democratic solution, which he actually envisions in what he labels and what he systematizes as anarchist communism. So I will finish with that, and I'm open to any questions in relation.
Thank you, Jose. Thank you, everyone, for watching and for making these very inspiring presentations. Now I'll present some questions of the public, and you all can make some as well to each other. Right. Peterson has a question for Emily Hayes. It's about the globe machine and how Kropotkin would, like speculatively, what Kropotkin would think about newer classroom technology that can show these maps and globes in a different way. All right. I'll state all questions and then I'll give time for you to answer. Breno has a question for Antonio about the creation of myths to legitimize and reaffirm anarcho-communism in politics. So about the intentions and of Krapotkin to create myths to legitimize and reaffirm anarcho-communism. And I'll add to this as a comment that Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist, he says that in his analysis of myth, he says that myth in modern society is like political ideology. So political ideology and myths are connected. And how could we elaborate that in anarchistic terms? All right, so Sean has a question for Antonio about the evidence of Kropotkin considering himself a historian and what he thinks about the scientificity of history. So as he makes this fabulation on history, is he himself a historian or not? And I have a question for Jose to elaborate a bit more on this difference between imperial states and popular states. Thank you, and you can all comment and make questions to each other. So I'll follow the same order I followed before, putting Jose on the end. And so we can have Emily, Antonio. I'm sorry no one made questions to Javier, but he can comment anything. You can comment anything you want. And then we have Jose, and you can make questions for each other. Thank you.
Hi. So thank you for that question. It's quite difficult to answer that, I think, even speculatively. But I will go back to the, so yeah, when you say newer classroom technology, do you mean contemporary technology? So that I wasn't quite clear about that. But there are a couple of things that came up in the 1904 post-lecture discussion after Reclus had presented, his globular maps to the Royal Geographical Society. A few things that came up that surprised me. So, for instance, in the edited discussion, Kropotkin seems to have some kind of faith in the truth of globular maps. And I kind of thought, whoa, that's putting a lot of faith in one thing. And I kind of made me want to pursue that a little bit more in his thought, this idea of truth. What I can say also is that he emphasizes books and literary texts, including travel writing, as a great learning tool, something that will teach us about the intellectual development of humanity over time. And that emphasis on travel writing is really interesting, because I think it's quite different from Mackinder's, for example. Mackinder puts more stress on the utility of the magic lantern, that early projecting machine, and of an images, so maps, but also photographs. But he's quite creative as well, actually, come to think of it. He uses all sorts of objects to teach with in an intuitive way. So there's one other thing that I can add to this is, and I'm not answering your question, I realize, but another thing that surprised me in Kropotkin's 1904 comments was that you see him turn capitalist. He basically says these maps, these globular maps might be expensive to produce now, but if we can increase demand for them and create a kind of mass market, then the production costs will come down. And I thought that was just, it was an interesting thing to see there. So that's my answer. I hope there's something in it for you. Thank you.
All right, so we can pass the ball to Antonio now.
Great, thank you. Thank you everyone for such fantastic presentations. I really learned a lot today. My mind is kind of buzzing with new thoughts. To the two questions that were read. So first, in terms of myths and the purpose, I think that it was very, very clear to Kropotkin that this has an ideological function. So if you also read the very famous pamphlets to the young, there's a passage there where Kropotkin uses this same expression, and he says, "Don't you know that history so far is a fable, an agreed upon fable on kings and parliaments and great personalities, and that the whole history of popular life is still to be written." So I think it was always an ideological position that popular history is needed. And having said that, it's interesting to note that it's not a particularly only anarchist position. It's a very typical statement in the Russian thinkers, radical thinkers, since the 1830s all the way to the revolution, to speak about the need for a popular history. Chernyshevsky is probably really the inspiration for Kropotkin in terms of insisting constantly on that need for a popular history. Having said that, and I think that connects also to the second question, this doesn't mean that Kropotkin didn't have an ambition to do his work scientifically. And indeed, he really had an ambition to do things scientifically. So much in the same way as in mutual aid, you see him trawling through a lot of literature from biologists and anthropologists and ethnologists. He did always the same with historians, and it's impressive actually the level of engagement, even with primary sources, that Kropotkin is always doing. And there's a reason for that, really, which is that, on the one hand, Kropotkin understood that every historical writing had a political position. So if you go through his footnotes in the Great Revolution, you'll see him put little comments saying, this historian is a reactionary, this historian is a moderate. So he's very aware that there's always a political slant, but he's also very concerned with the idea that there are facts that are ignored. So for instance, he will tell you, the fact of general insurrection is a fact. It's not an ideological position. So it's a combined thing. He did believe in a scientific method in history. Now, that goes to the second part, or the first part rather, of the second question, on whether Kropotkin considered himself a historian. Now, if you read Martin Miller's biography, which was written now a very long time ago in '72, there's actually a little passage about Kropotkin's correspondence with his brother in 1858, where Kropotkin says, everyone calls me the little historian in the military academy because I love reading history so much. And I'm translating all these French texts, and I got admitted to the Imperial Library to read the manuscripts from the 13th century. And Kropotkin, the 16-year-old Kropotkin, is very happy, dreaming he's going to be a historian. And then Alexander, like a classic older sibling, destroys all these dreams and says, what are you doing looking at history? This is the time of materialism. You should be a naturalist. And this is actually also what starts Kropotkin getting more and more interested in geography, physical geography especially. So The answer to that is Kropotkin once very actively dreamed of being literally an academic historian. He was very familiar with the work of history in its great details. And so I'm tempted to say that, yes, he did think of himself as a historian. But in a sense, Kropotkin was more concerned with popularizing ideas and synthesizing the work of academics with a political slant than doing original research. So yeah, I hope that sort of answers your questions. Thank you.
All right, so now we have Xavier HALLEZ, and we can, there's a question for him about the Bashkir movement. Was it linked to any other national minority in the Soviet Union or Russia? And I have a question too, because I had a Muslim anarchist friend, and he used to say that Allah was above all, but behind him there was nothing else. So it's a sort of atheist anarchism, and I would like to know if there was something like that happening with the Bashkir movement.
So here, Sultan was not Bashkir, but you got some different Muslim population in the Russian Empire, and where the main was the Tatars, and then we also the Bashkir. Sultan just was born in the Bashkir region. That's quite a very complex questions, because of course there were some link with other Muslim population. But anyway, it was a kind of division because, for example, Sultan Galiev did not have real contact with Muslim from the Turkestan, or even from with Azeri or Muslim from the Caucasus. So all the movement was really divided, and so that's also a reason why. During the 20s, when there was the foundation of the USSR, they didn't manage to have a real force, to be a real force in the Soviet Union. So they tried to make the kind of union of communist and or socialist forces, but they never really managed to do a real unite organization. So there were kind of links, but mainly there were conflict, a lot of conflict, because as we see in Russia, there is a lot of different socialist orientation, and it's what we could see also in Muslims population. But within Muslim population, these socialists were very few, so they were really divided. And there is a question about also Makhno. No, they didn't care about what was happening in Ukraine and with the Makhnovshchina, and they were more interested with what was happening with Muslim, because there was a lot of to do to have a real organization and to be able to implement their policy and to get some power from the Bolshevik party. So they didn't really was interested in this kind of things. And as I said, anarchism was one of the influence was really important before 1917, but after they didn't really mention it, and they didn't get really acquaintance with other anarchist organization because of this separation between Russian and non-Russian, which was really a strong one. And for Allah, of course, that's one of the questions of, for example, Sultan Galiev. He always tried to make kind of consensus or between Islam and communism, and tried not to go against Islam and to make a kind of mix with between Islam and communism. And in a sense, we can find some of elements who are similar to what we will see in Indonesia or in India, where there is some revolutionary try to make also this this mix of the two. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Javier. Now we have the answers from Jose Antonio. There's another question for you. To which extent did Krapotkin consult primary sources as we understand today? Was he doing more meta-historical and ideological inventions?
Thank you.
Pardon, sorry. Jose, I was asking a question to Antonio, but I was talking to Jose. I made some confusion here. But this is some new questions. And also a question from Emily that anyone can answer, and then I'll pass to Jose. Could anybody tell me about sources where Krapotkin writes on modern science and anarchism? And she mentions Mackinder, who turned historian and philosopher of science later on in his life. Right, so I'll pass the ball to Jose, and then to the other Antonio.
Well, just in relation to Emily's question, which I will reply straight away. I mean, there's actually a pamphlet called Modern Science and Anarchism, you know, and that's what you're referring to. So, yeah, okay, so yeah. Then I will jump straight to my own questions. I just wanted to get that clear. In relation to the questions, okay, there was a first question of Guilherme in which you asked me if I could expand a little bit on Kropotkin's contributions to the sociology of state. I'll be very clear, very short, and straight to the point. The first one is he does this link between violence and state building, very clear, without any totalitarian undertones, without any civilizing mission sort of undertone either. Okay, he doesn't see these necessarily as part of human evolution. Okay, and that sets him aside from all of the other sociologists at the time, including Marx. Okay, and that I think it's a very important contribution in its own terms, and also the fact that he is before John Galtung, his understanding that violence is far more than physical violence. And he's understanding as well this web of structural institutional violences. Okay, and that's, I think, a very important contribution. The second one, okay, as a contribution is the fact that he links this idea of understanding the origins of the state in order to his own view of a future that is not created out of the blue. It doesn't come out like a rabbit out of magician hat. But that we need to develop certain tendencies existing in society, okay, which he dealt with in detail in Mutual Aid, and we need to develop those tendencies in order to have the rudiments of a more egalitarian, inclusive, freer society. Okay, and the third contribution, which you asked me to expand a bit more on, is that he sees these two traditions. Okay. He's not European-centered. He sees the same tradition in Indonesia. He analyzes a few other examples, okay, in which he says it's a popular, a federative tendency in which the autonomy is the autonomy of the commune, the autonomy of the city, the autonomy of the human group is seen as the predominant value, whereas there is an imperial tradition which he links very clearly to the Roman Empire. Okay, and he sees these as a very top-down tradition, and that's the tradition from which the state comes. Whereas the other organizational tradition, it's more akin to federalism or even a sort of communistic tradition. Of course, there's a number of moral issues that can be discussed. You know, we can discuss sometimes how these local orders can be as well very repressive, and we can discuss all that. But by and large, there's these two big tendencies. Now, that has been taken up, as I said, by Öcalan in his book on the origins of civilization, and also in the Third Revolution by Krobotkin. But a non-sympathetic author like Thomas Erdmann, or not necessarily non-sympathetic, I took politics with him, so I don't know if he would be sympathetic or not, but someone who's not explicitly anarchist in any way. And he writes The Birth of Leviathan. He adds a substantial amount of evidence collected for 100 years before the initial evidence that Kropotkin had in order to come up with the systematic view of these two traditions. Okay, Thomas Erdmann comes with systematic systematic evidence, a wide-ranging archival work to demonstrate that his view, well, he doesn't mention actually Kropotkin, but what he does is demonstrate or validate this broad distinction of Kropotkin, in the sense that Thomas Herman, what he says is the Roman Empire organized unevenly across time and space in Europe. And in those areas where the Roman Empire was stronger, the centralist traditions tend to be stronger. And in those areas where the state was only peripheral, the Roman Empire was only peripheral, they could keep some of these more bottom-up and more direct democratic kind of institutions. And I think that that's a very good, that's actually a very good validation. I think that book in particular, plus some of the recent what's called the belligerent sociology of the state, it validates the need to reappraise Kropotkin as something which he is rarely mentioned as, which is a sociology of the state. And I think that he is a sociologist of the state, and his contribution should be acknowledged. And I have a question here that says, can we say Kropotkin's view of the state is representative of anarchism or differs significantly from other anarchists? I think that Kropotkin's view, it's unique in two ways. First, in the way that he made, unlike Proudhon or like Bakunin or Goldman, he made very systematic research in order to arrive to his conclusions. He was not talking just from what he read here and there. I mean, like Bakunin himself, he talks in God and State and Anarchism about the conquest theory of state. He says that in the origin of state, it's not social contract, it is conquest, but there are mentions in passing. In Krapotkin, there's a full-fledged theory of the state, okay? And it's unique also in the sense that he identifies, even within the state, this tradition of resistance to state making, and this tradition of resistance coming from the original idea of commune, of a commune, which is quite widespread in humanity. And I think that that's another point that makes him very relevant to the most recent sociology of the state, which regards resistance as a crucial aspect. Okay, in Charles Tilly, and I'm not going to extend too much on this, I'm going to take just 2 minutes. In Charles Tilly theory of the state, okay, the state needs to mobilize the population in order to make war, but when they mobilize the population, they encounter resistance. People resist the draft, people make demands and make claims in order to participate in warfare and so on and so forth. And you say, well, resistance to recruitment is actually one of the first rudiments that we have of citizenship rights. Because in order to serve queen and country, you need to be given something back. So resistance is fruitful in the sense that it creates a system of mutual obligation, which is the basis of democracy. Kropotkin takes the idea of resistance far beyond that. Okay, not just as a system of mutual obligations, but about a system that can actually replace what we have, the actual existing institutions, into a system based on an egalitarian and horizontal distribution of obligations, which he envisages in mutual aid. But I think that this idea of resistance, of this idea of the centrality of resistance in order to create the base of what we would call a democratic system in the present, it's critical in Kropotkin, but Kropotkin take it a step forward. Take it a step further than Tilly or even Sidney Tarrow, who's one of the last authors to go into resistance and state making and warfare, a kind of analysis. He goes beyond what any of them would have gone, and I think that requires in itself a replacement of his role as a sociologist of the state. And I'm thinking of writing a paper out of this presentation, so hopefully we can take the discussion further then.
Thank you, Jose Antonio, and now to Antonio.
Yes, so to Todu, is it Todu's question? I don't know Benedetto Croce, so I can't comment on similarities with Croce. But yes, Kropotkin's definitely engaging quite actively with primary sources whenever he can. I mean, take the fact that, he's just arrived in England in 1876. And when he finally manages to go to London, the first thing this crazy dude does after having spent an awful time in prison and in exile is go to the British Museum to see original pamphlets from the French Revolution. He was a huge believer in going to the archives, and that reflects his immense admiration for Romantic historians of the early 19th century, who were very remarkable precisely for going to the archives extensively for the first time. I think if you really want to understand Kropotkin's approach to history and one of his biggest idols, look at his relation to Augustin Thierry, who Kropotkin admired so much that he constantly called him a socialist when he was a liberal monarchist, actually. That's a very important relation for Kropotkin. And actually, Jose Antonio, you might also enjoy to look into that, because part of Kropotkin's first theories of state respond to Thierry's theories of the emergence of the French state, and that's quite interesting. I think that's it. So I wouldn't say that it's not pure ideology. It is serious work, and there's a reason why a series of scholars would refer to Kropotkin's work as scientific. So Ernest Nies, doing international law, is one of those examples. But to Emily's question, if I can contribute something to that on the modern science and anarchism, the first thing to note is that it's a book with a very complicated editorial history. It comes out at different points with different lengths, and it first comes out in a series of articles. So I would say it's always really useful to look at the articles, not so much for what he's reading, but for the political context, because often in his books he wants to look more academic and he's not so explicit about what's motivating him politically. Yes, and apart from that, I think, it's still Herbert Spencer is a huge part of that reflection. And to my knowledge, Mackinder doesn't engage really with Herbert Spencer. And Kropotkin does, and he sees Herbert Spencer as potentially going further than Auguste Comte. So that's part of it. And he also has some references to Romantic historians. Augustin Thierry is one of them I mentioned, and also some Russians. But yes, I think you have your work cut out for you, because it's a big medley of references, and I only know very few, actually. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Antonio. So I'd like to thank everyone for being here for these very good presentations, and now we can have a very short goodbye notice from each one, and we'll have another panel now on 11:30 in Brazilian time. So let's go, comrades.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. See you later.